Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the layers of a history that's tucked away in shadowed alcoves and forgotten manuscripts, where passion simmered beneath vows of purity, love, lust, and forbidden yearnings in the medieval world. And before we dive in, just a heads up, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's too steamy, though it might be, but because imagining yourself in those drafty halls with a restless heart could make you question every quiet moment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step through the heavy oak doors of a medieval monastery, the kind perched on a misty hillside in rural England, where the chill seeps into your bones like an unwelcome whisper. The air hangs thick with the scent of beeswax candles, musty parchment, and faint herbs from the infirmary. Lavender mixed with something sharper, like rue, meant to ward off ills of the body and soul. It's eerily silent, save for the distant toll of a bell calling monks to Compline, the final prayer before nightfall swallows the world. But beneath this veil of piety, you sense an undercurrent, a flicker of something human and insistent. Desire, coiling like smoke in the dim corridors. As you wander the cloisters, stone floors worn smooth by centuries of sandaled feet, you notice the monks in their coarse wool habits, tonsures shaved into perfect circles atop their heads, a symbol of renunciation. They're meant to have forsaken the world, including the temptations of the flesh, dedicating themselves to prayer, labor, and contemplation. Yet, in this isolated haven, far from the distractions of bustling towns, the battle against lust rages fiercest. You catch a glimpse of Brother Edmund, a young novice with calloused hands from tending the herb garden, stealing furtive glances at a visiting pilgrim woman during Vespers. His fingers tighten on his prayer beads, knuckles white, as if the wooden spheres could anchor him against the storm inside. Mainstream history tells us that monasteries were hotbeds of internal conflict. Records from the 12th century, like those from Cluny Abbey in France, reveal confessionals overflowing with admissions of nocturnal pollutions, wet dreams that left monks racked with guilt, fearing eternal damnation for thoughts they couldn't control. Abbots prescribed harsh remedies, flagellation with knotted cords, immersion in icy baths at dawn, or endless recitations of psalms to drown out impure visions. One abbot's diary describes a brother so tormented by dreams of a local milkmaid that he slept with a stone pillow, hoping discomfort would banish the softness of imagined skin. It rarely worked. Isolation amplified cravings, turning the mind into a pressure cooker of forbidden fantasies. However, here's a quirky tidbit that adds a layer of oddity. Some monks practiced a form of dream discipline, akin to lucid dreaming techniques borrowed from ancient texts smuggled out of Byzantine libraries. They trained to recognize seductive apparitions in sleep and counter them by visualizing saints or chanting Latin phrases during the dream. A 13th century manuscript from a German monastery details one friar who claimed he could summon a vision of the Virgin Mary to chase away temptresses, turning erotic nightmares into holy triumphs, though skeptics whispered he was just repressing deeper urges. You pause by a scriptorium, where illuminated manuscripts glow under flickering lamplight, their margins adorned with whimsical doodles, a monk chasing a fox, or a nun plucking flowers that suspiciously resemble phallic shapes. These subtle rebellions hint at the constant war within. Nuns faced similar torments in their convents, often writing veiled accounts of dark visitors in letters to confessors. One 14th century Italian nun described a recurring dream of a shadowy figure with breath like incense and hands of fire, begging for divine intervention to quench the flame that consumes without burning. Historians still argue whether these were genuine spiritual struggles or coded expressions of same-sex attractions in all-female environments, where emotional bonds blurred into physical yearnings under the guise of sisterly devotion. As you explore further, slipping into the refectory where sparse meals of bread and watery ale are served in silence, you overhear fragments of whispered conversations during rare moments of recreation. A senior monk admonishes a younger one for lingering too long near the laundry, where lay sisters wash linens, their sleeves rolled up to reveal forbidden glimpses of skin. "The devil dances in idle eyes," he mutters, echoing teachings from St. Augustine, who viewed lust as original sin's lingering curse. Yet scandals erupted despite vigilance. A double monastery in 11th century Normandy was dissolved after rumors of entanglements between monks and nuns led to pregnancies blamed on miraculous interventions or demonic trickery. The Church's response? Stricter segregation. But human nature persisted. Venturing into the dormitory, you imagine the long rows of straw pallets, each monk curled under a thin blanket, the night filled with stifled sighs and restless shifts. Dreams here weren't private. Morning confessions turned them into communal burdens. One infamous case involved an abbess who admitted to visions of Christ as a sensual bridegroom, her descriptions echoing the erotic mysticism of later figures like Saint Teresa. Was it piety or projection? The debate rages on, with some scholars seeing it as a sublimated desire in a sexless life. Adding intrigue, you discover hidden tunnels beneath some abbeys, ostensibly for escape during raids, but whispered to facilitate midnight rendezvous. In one French site, archaeologists unearthed love tokens, carved wooden hearts, buried near cell walls, suggesting affairs that defied vows. A light joke crosses your mind. Perhaps the real miracle was keeping secrets in a place where even coughs echoed like thunder. As Vespers end, you slip out a side gate, the chants fading like distant thunder. The moon rises, casting silver on the fields, and an owl hoots, a reminder that nature, like desire, doesn't heed walls. You've glimpsed the fragility of vows, how silence breeds storms, and how even the holiest hearts beat with forbidden rhythms. You leave the monastery behind, the chants still echoing faintly in your ears like a half-remembered melody, and find yourself drawn toward a secluded hermitage nestled in a forested glen, where the air carries the sweet decay of fallen leaves and the distant rush of a hidden stream. This is no ordinary retreat. It's a place where saints and mystics sought solitude, only to encounter visions that blurred the sacred and the sensual in ways that left scribes blushing over their quills. As you approach, the stone walls seem to pulse with an otherworldly energy, shadows dancing from the flicker of a single oil lamp inside. You're stepping into the realm of ecstatic revelations, where holy men and women wrestled with apparitions that felt all too fleshly, turning spiritual quests into intimate battles that echoed through centuries. Settling on a rough-hewn bench outside the hermitage, you imagine St. Francis of Assisi, not in his familiar pose with birds and beasts, but in the throes of a vision where divine love manifested as piercing wounds, the stigmata, that some contemporaries described with language bordering on the erotic, his body arching in a mix of agony and bliss. Mainstream accounts from the 13th century, like those in the Little Flowers of St. Francis, portray him receiving these marks from a seraphim, but whispers in monastic circles suggested the experience was so intense it left him trembling, as if embraced by an invisible lover whose touch burned deeper than fire. Saints like him weren't immune to the body's language. Their hagiographies often wove threads of physical yearning into tales of transcendence, making holiness feel dangerously close to human passion. Deeper into this mystical territory, you envision St. Catherine of Siena, a 14th century Dominican tertiary who took her vow of virginity as a child and later described mystical marriage to Christ in vivid bodily terms. She claimed to receive an invisible ring made from his holy foreskin during a vision, a detail that shocked even her confessors but symbolized an unbreakable union. Her letters brim with descriptions of being consumed by divine fire, her heart pierced in ecstasy that left her weak for days. Was this pure spirituality or a channel for unspoken desires in a life of self-denial? You can't help but chuckle at the thought. In an era without romance novels, saints penned their steamy alternatives, cloaked in allegory. One cheeky aside from a later commentator noted that if modern therapy existed, Catherine might have been prescribed a cold shower instead of canonization. But not all visions were so tender. You shift uncomfortably as you recall St. Anthony of Egypt, the desert father who fled to the wilderness to escape temptation, only to be assaulted by demonic hordes in forms that shifted from ferocious beasts to alluring women. His biography, penned by Athanasius in the 4th century, but echoed in medieval retellings, details how he rolled in thorn bushes to quell arousal, his skin torn as a testament to resistance. These torments weren't rare. They populated the lives of the saints, popular reading material that doubled as cautionary erotica for the devout. Picture a monk in a scriptorium, illuminating a page where Anthony battles a seductive phantom, his brush lingering a bit too long on the curves. Artistic license or personal projection? Venturing mentally into female mystics' experiences adds layers of complexity. St. Margaret of Cortona, a 13th century penitent who abandoned a life of sin for asceticism, reported visions where Christ appeared as a jealous lover, demanding her full devotion and punishing stray thoughts with spiritual lashes that felt achingly real. Her confessor documented these encounters, noting how she writhed on the floor, moaning in a blend of pain and rapture that drew curious crowds. Historians still argue whether these were authentic religious experiences or manifestations of trauma from her earlier years as a mistress, repressed desires resurfacing in acceptable forms. Some scholars lean towards psychological interpretations, suggesting sleep paralysis or hallucinations fueled by fasting, while others defend them as genuine encounters with the numinous, where the erotic served as a metaphor for union with God. A quirky fringe element emerges in the tales of lesser-known visionaries, like a 12th century hermit in Wales who claimed nightly visits from an angel who anointed him with oils that induced dreams of paradisiacal gardens filled with naked souls in harmonious embrace. He documented recipes for herbal salves to invite such visions, blending mandrake and henbane, hallucinogens that modern science confirms could spark vivid, sensual hallucinations. Was he a mystic or an early experimenter in altered states? His writings were suppressed, but fragments survived in alchemical texts, hinting at an underground tradition where spirituality and pharmacology intertwined, perhaps explaining why some saints' ecstasies sound suspiciously like trips. As you gaze at the hermitage door, cracked open to reveal a simple cell with a straw mat and crucifix, you ponder Saint John of the Cross, whose Dark Night of the Soul, from the late medieval period, describes spiritual dryness, giving way to intimate divine encounters. His poetry, laden with bridal imagery. O night that guided me, O night more lovely than the dawn. It's easy to see why censors hesitated. The lines read like love letters, blurring God and lover in a haze of metaphor. A light joke here. If Tinder existed back then, saints might have swiped right on the Almighty, bio reading seeking eternal flame, must love thorns. These visions weren't confined to solitude. They influenced art and literature, with medieval frescoes depicting saints in throes that could pass for romantic agony. In one Italian chapel, a mural shows Saint Sebastian bound and arrow-pierced, his expression a mix of suffering and subtle pleasure, inspiring countless admirers, including, rumor has it, a few who confessed to impure thoughts while praying before it. The Church navigated this tightrope carefully, promoting visions as signs of favor while suppressing those too explicit, like a Belgian mystic's account of being ravished by the Holy Spirit in ways that left her bedclothes disarrayed. You rise from the bench as dusk deepens, the forest whispering secrets of its own. These ecstatic encounters reveal a medieval world where the line between holy and horny was as thin as a veil, where demons tempted with what the heart craved most, and saints found God in sensations that mirrored earthly delights. Historians debate if this erotic mysticism empowered women, giving them a voice through visions in a patriarchal church, or if it reinforced repression by framing desire as an otherworldly trial. Either way, it adds a spicy undercurrent to the era's spirituality. Leaving the glen, you feel the pull toward grander courts, where longing wasn't hidden in dreams, but performed in elaborate dances of chivalry and deceit. You emerge from the misty glen, the hermitage's whispers fading like a dream half forgotten at dawn, and follow a winding path that climbs toward a towering castle silhouetted against a crimson sunset, its banners snapping lazily in the breeze like invitations to secrets. The air shifts here, carrying hints of roasted venison, spiced mulled wine, and the faint floral perfume of rose gardens manicured to perfection. This is the realm of the nobility, where stone walls enclose not just lands and lineages, but elaborate games of the heart, courtly love, that peculiar medieval invention blending poetry, pining, and just enough peril to make it thrilling. As you approach the drawbridge, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones mixes with lute strings being plucked in the great hall, drawing you into a world where desire is dressed in silk and performed like a well-rehearsed mask. Slipping through the gates unnoticed, you find yourself in the bustling courtyard, where knights in polished armor practice jousts under the watchful eyes of ladies perched on balconies, their gowns flowing like waterfalls of emerald and gold. Courtly love wasn't about hasty tumbles in the hay. It was an art form, a ritualized longing that elevated unfulfilled yearning to something noble, almost holy. You watch a young squire kneel before a duchess, presenting an embroidered handkerchief as a token, his voice quavering with vows of eternal service. She accepts it with a coy smile, her fingers brushing his just long enough to send a shiver through the air. This dance, inspired by troubadour songs from 12th century Provence, turned flirtation into philosophy. Love should be secret, unattainable, and painfully pure, because consummation would spoil the poetry. Mainstream history highlights how figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine championed this ideal in her 12th century courts, hosting courts of love where noble women debated romantic dilemmas like judges in a mock trial. Should a knight favor a jealous lover or a distant ideal? These gatherings shaped literature, influencing works like Chrétien de Troyes, Lancelot, where the knight's affair with Queen Guinevere becomes a tragic ode to forbidden passion. But beneath the verses, real affairs simmered. Eleanor's own life was a whirlwind of strategic marriages and rumored liaisons, proving that courtly rules were guidelines, not gospel. You can't help a soft chuckle imagining her rolling her eyes at overly dramatic suitors. Darling, if you're going to pine, at least bring better wine. Venturing into the great hall, the warmth envelops you. Log fires roaring in massive hearths, tables laden with pheasant, figs, and goblets overflowing with claret that stains lips like unspoken sins. Here, the games intensify. A lord composes a sonnet praising his lady's eyes as stars that guide my wandering soul, while she feigns indifference, fanning herself with a feather that hides a smirk. Yet, scratch the surface, and the purity crumbles. Many of these chaste declarations masked very physical entanglements. Knights wore their ladies' sleeves into battle as favors, but back at the castle, those same sleeves might end up discarded in alcoves during stolen moments. One quirky tidbit stands out. In 13th century tournaments, some knights competed in melees of love, mock battles where the prize wasn't gold, but a kiss from the queen of the day, though records hint that victors often claimed more in private tents, with chaperones conveniently distracted by minstrels' tunes. You trail a pair of nobles down a dimly lit corridor, tapestries depicting heroic quests muffling their footsteps, and overhear whispers of arrangements that bend the rules. A baroness, married for alliance, entertains a troubadour in her solar, their poetry lessons extending well past sunset. This wasn't uncommon. Political marriages left room for emotional outlets, with husbands often turning a blind eye as long as discretion held and heirs arrived on schedule. But scandals erupted when lines blurred. A duke in Burgundy once challenged a rival to a duel over a misplaced glove that symbolized far more than courtesy, leading to a feud that reshaped borders. Modern asides make it relatable. Think of it as medieval texting, where a dropped emoji or scarf could launch 1,000 ships, or at least a few awkward family dinners. As the evening feast unfolds, you observe the subtle choreography. glances exchanged over trenchers of spiced meat, feet brushing under tables heavy with silverware, and coded messages passed via servants who pretend not to notice. Courtly love's emphasis on suffering, the sweet agony of denial, mirrored religious ecstasy, perhaps explaining why the church tolerated it grudgingly, viewing it as a lesser evil than outright adultery. Yet, friars preached against its secular focus, calling it the devil's ballad. One light joke bubbles up. If today's dating apps had existed, profiles might read, "Seeking unattainable muse for endless sonnets, no hookups, just heartache." Deeper intrigue reveals how these rituals empowered women in unexpected ways. Noble women, often pawns in marital chess, used courtly favor to wield influence. Granting a knight her ribbon could sway alliances or secure favors. In the courts of Marie de Champagne, Eleanor's daughter, ladies ruled these romantic tribunals, deciding cases that subtly mirrored real politics. But not all ended poetically. A spurned lover in Aragon once poisoned a rival's chalice during a banquet, turning a metaphor of dying for love into a grim reality. You linger by a window overlooking moonlit gardens, where couples stroll arm in arm, their laughter soft against the night. Historians still argue whether courtly love was a genuine emotional expression or a sophisticated cover for power plays and extramarital adventures. Some see it as proto-romanticism, fostering individual feelings in a feudal world. Others as elitist theatre, reinforcing class divides, where peasants had no time for such luxuries. Either way, it wove desire into the fabric of nobility, making every glance a potential epic. As the lute fades and candles gutter, you sense the pull toward humbler hearths, where love isn't sung, but lived in the raw rhythm of daily toil. As the lute's final notes dissolve into the castle's echoing halls and the candles sputter their last protests against the encroaching dark, you feel that inexorable tug downward, away from gilded chambers and perfumed intrigues toward the earthy pulse of village life. The path winds through moonlit meadows, past hedgerows heavy with night-blooming jasmine that scents the air like a forgotten promise, leading you to a cluster of thatched cottages huddled together like gossiping neighbors in a foggy lowland hollow. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, carrying the comforting aroma of peat fires and simmering pottage, turnips, barley, and whatever scraps the day yielded. This is the world of the common folk, where love doesn't parade in verse or velvet, but unfolds in the gritty rhythm of shared labor, stolen glances over looms, and nights crammed into single-room dwellings where privacy is as rare as a lord's mercy. You duck under a low lintel into one such home, the interior a cozy chaos of flickering rushlight casting long shadows on dirt floors strewn with fresh rushes and dried herbs to mask the ever-present tang of livestock just beyond the wattle walls. A family gathers around a trestle table, father mending a net, mother carding wool, children fidgeting on stools, while a goat bleats indignantly from its corner pen. Here, romance isn't a lofty ideal. It's practical, woven into survival like threads in a homespun tunic. Couples court amid the daily grind, helping with harvests, sharing ale at village fairs, or walking home from church under stars that feel closer in the countryside's vast quiet. Mainstream records from 14th century English manorial courts show that premarital relations were common, often leading to hasty weddings when pregnancies arose, with communities enforcing unions through social pressure rather than holy writ. Fines for lewdness were levied, but lightly, acknowledging that desire didn't wait for blessings in a world where life was short and winters long. Venturing deeper into this rustic intimacy, you learn of bundling, that curious custom in parts of rural Wales and northern Europe, where betrothed youths spent nights together in bed, fully clothed, separated by a board, or bundled in sacks to test compatibility without, theoretically, crossing lines. Parents turned a blind eye, reasoning it built bonds before vows. But let's be real. You picture two teenagers, hormones raging like a summer storm, with only a plank between them, and think, yeah, that board probably saw more action than it prevented. Sensory details paint the scene. The scratchy wool blankets, the faint warmth of shared breath in the chill air, the rustle of straw mattresses that amplified every shift. It wasn't foolproof. Church rolls brim with baptisms mere months after weddings, hinting at premature negotiations that communities accepted with a wink, expecting the couple to formalize things post-haste. Outside, under a canopy of ancient oaks, where fireflies dance like errant sparks from a blacksmith's forge, you witness stolen moments that defy the day's drudgery. A lad and lass slip away during a harvest festival, their laughter muffled by stacks of hay that smell sweet and dusty, hands exploring in the golden twilight. Peasant love was tender but hurried, laced with risks like unwanted babes or community scorn, yet it thrived in its honesty. No masks of courtly pretense, just raw need met in forests or behind barns. A quirky fringe tidbit emerges from folklore in rural Scotland. Couples carved love knots into ancient standing stones, believing the runes bound their fates eternally, even without a priest's nod. Archaeologists have found these etchings, some with initials intertwined like vines, suggesting a pagan holdover where nature witnessed vows the church ignored. Imagine the irony, a stone older than Christianity playing matchmaker. While vicars preached abstinence from afar, you join a group at the village green, where elders spin yarns by a bonfire that crackles with pine resin, sparks ascending like prayers to indifferent gods. They recount charivari, those raucous mock parades shaming adulterers or mismatched pairs. A cuckolded husband ridden backward on a donkey while neighbors bang pots and hoot insults, half punishment, half entertainment. It reeks of communal catharsis, venting frustrations on those who strayed, but with a humorous edge. One tale involves a bride too eager on her wedding night, leading to a dawn charivari, where villagers gifted her a wooden spoon for stirring trouble. Light-hearted, sure, until you consider the underlying cruelty, especially for women bearing the brunt of whispers. In the midwife's hut, lit by a tallow lamp that flickers like a hesitant heartbeat, you overhear practical wisdom passed in hushed tones, herbal teas of pennyroyal to bring on the moon for unintended conceptions, or charms sewn into skirts for fertility. This agency, quiet and folkloric, empowered women in a male-dominated world, though it skirted witchcraft accusations. Midwives like this one, with her gap-toothed grin and hands scarred from deliveries, joke that nobles have poets for love, we have haylofts, and fewer regrets. Another quip surfaces in records. A peasant quipping to a tax collector, My wife's kisses cost nothing, unlike your lord's fines, highlighting class divides in affection's economy. As dawn breaks, painting the thatch in rosy hues, you reflect on how peasant passions shape society from the ground up. Historians still argue whether these earthy romances were more egalitarian than noble ones, with some claiming the lack of dowries fostered genuine bonds, while others point to patriarchal controls mirroring feudal hierarchies, where women traded autonomy for security. Either way, in these humble abodes, love bloomed resiliently, unadorned but unbreakable, like wildflowers pushing through cracked earth. The morning mist lifts, revealing a distant spire where veiled figures move in solemn procession, pulling you toward the cloistered whispers of those who traded freedom for faith. The morning mist lifts, revealing a distant spire where veiled figures move in solemn procession, pulling you toward the cloistered whispers of those who traded freedom for faith. You approach the convent gates, iron-wrought and ivy-cloaked, creaking open with a sigh that echoes the resigned breaths of generations within. The courtyard unfolds before you, a serene expanse of flagstones swept clean, bordered by herb beds where rosemary and thyme release their sharp, clean scents into the crisp air, mingling with the faint, lingering trace of incense from mourning lords. This is a world of women bound by vows, their habits whispering against stone as they glide past, eyes downcast but minds alive with thoughts that no superior could fully police. You're entering the hidden realm of nuns' private writings, where ink-stained fingers captured yearnings that the church preferred to ignore, turning parchment into silent confidence for desires that simmered beneath layers of linen and liturgy. You slip into the scriptorium, a room bathed in slanted light from narrow windows, dust motes dancing like forbidden thoughts in the beams. Shelves groan under the weight of bound volumes, psalters, theological tracts, but tucked away in locked chests are the real treasures, personal diaries, letters, and poems scrawled in moments stolen from endless hours of prayer. These weren't meant for prying eyes, yet they survived, offering glimpses into souls that weren't as serene as their veils suggested. Mainstream historical fact points to figures like Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess whose voluminous writings included not just visions and music, but intimate correspondences hinting at deep emotional ties. In letters to her confidant Richardis, Hildegard poured out grief over their separation, describing it as a wound that bleeds without ceasing. Language so passionate, it reads like a lover's lament rather than a superior's concern. Her words, preserved in Latin manuscripts, reveal how convent life fostered bonds that blurred friendship and affection, especially in an era when women entered nunneries not always by choice, but as familial strategy or escape from worse fates. Venturing deeper, you imagine a novice hunched over a desk by candlelight, the flame flickering like her resolve, penning entries that confess dreams of soft arms encircling in the night, veiled references to fellow sisters whose presence in shared dormitories stirred more than sisterly warmth. Winter nights were particularly telling. With fuel scarce, nuns often doubled up in beds for heat, their bodies pressed close under heavy blankets that muffled breaths and accidental touches. Enforcement of rules against particular friendships was spotty. Abbesses issued warnings, but in remote convents, dim lighting and mutual silence allowed intimacies to flourish unchecked. You can't suppress a gentle smirk at the thought. In a place where silence was golden, the real vow broken was often the one against whispering sweet nothings after Compline. One light joke from a later satirical pamphlet quipped that convent walls were thick to keep sins in, not sinners out, poking fun at how isolation bred what it aimed to banish. Among these writings, coded language abounds. Roses symbolizing passion, birds for fleeting joys, turning devotionals into covert love notes. A 13th century English nun's journal, unearthed in an abbey archive, describes the golden light of Sister Eleanor's smile illuminating my darkest hours, with marginal drawings of intertwined vines that scholars interpret as subtle emblems of unity. These weren't always overt. Many entries cloak longing in spiritual metaphors, like one Spanish sister's plea for God to harden my heart against the warmth that threatens to melt it. A clear nod to temptations too risky to name outright. But scandals did surface. In a 14th century Italian convent, an abbess discovered a cache of letters between two nuns detailing nights of shared prayer that extended into dawn's embrace, leading to seclusion for the writers and a stern papal inquiry. The Church's response? More rules, but the heart's ink flowed on. A quirky fringe tidbit adds whimsy to the solemnity. Some nuns incorporated love filters into their writings, recipes for herbal inks scented with violet or myrrh, believed to infuse letters with enchanting properties when read by the intended. One preserved example from a Flemish convent includes a postscript. May this ink bind our souls as it stains the page, hinting at a blend of mysticism and mild sorcery that blurred piety with potion-making. Imagine the recipient unfolding the parchment, inhaling the faint floral essence, and feeling a pull that no vow could sever. Romantic, or just the power of suggestion in a scent-starved world. You pause by a cloister arch, overlooking a garden where sisters tend flowers under a leaden sky, their hands dirt-streaked, but movements graceful, like dances restrained by habit. These writings weren't mere outlets. They were acts of resistance, preserving inner lives in a system that demanded uniformity. Letters passed under doors or hidden in prayer books fostered networks of affection, sometimes spanning convents via traveling pilgrims. One German nun's correspondence with a distant soul sister spans years, evolving from theological debates to admissions of hunger for your nearness that no feast can sate, raising questions about emotional sustenance in celibate confines. Yet, not all was shadowed in secrecy. Some abbesses chronicled missteps openly in ledgers, like a 15th century French record of a nun caught with a laywoman disguised as a novice, their embraces discovered in the laundry. Punishment? Extra fasts and prayers, but no expulsion. Family ties to donors often softened blows. This leniency hints at pragmatism amid piety, where human frailty was acknowledged, if not celebrated. As Vespers bells toll, calling the sisters to the chapel where hymns rise in harmonious waves, you reflect on these intimate archives. Historians still argue whether nuns' writings represent genuine queer histories or platonic intensities amplified by isolation. Some view them as early feminist expressions of autonomy, others as coping mechanisms in gender-segregated spaces, where affection filled voids left by denied freedoms. Either way, these pages whisper of lives fuller than vows allowed, ink defying the silence imposed. The bells fade, and a confessional's latticed shadow beckons from a nearby chapel, drawing you toward murmurs where sins are spilled and sometimes shared. The bells fade, and a confessional's latticed shadow beckons from a nearby chapel, drawing you toward murmurs where sins are spilled and sometimes shared. You push open the weathered door, hinges groaning like reluctant confessions, stepping into a space dimmed by stained glass that filters sunlight into jewel-toned puddles on the flagstone floor. The air is thick here, laced with the resinous bite of frankincense and the faint, underlying mustiness of aged wood polished by countless knees. This is the heart of the medieval church's moral machinery, where priests sat behind screens, ears attuned to the whispers of the faithful, absorbing tales of transgression that often mirrored their hidden battles. As you settle into a pew, creaking under your weight, you feel the weight of centuries of secrets pressing in, like ghosts lingering just out of sight. You imagine sliding into the confessional booth itself, the curtain falling shut with a soft hush, enclosing you in a cocoon of carved oak that smells faintly of beeswax and sweat. On the other side, a priest shifts, his breath audible through the lattice, a man sworn to celibacy since the 12th century reforms under Pope Gregory VII, yet human enough to feel the pull of what he hears. Mainstream historical fact underscores the irony. Parish records from 13th century England reveal priests routinely absolving villagers for acts like fornication or adultery, only to face their temptations amplified by the intimacy of the rite. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 mandated annual confessions for all, turning these booths into repositories of raw humanity, where farmers admitted to hayloft trysts and merchants to brothel visits, their words hanging in the air like smoke. But the struggles ran deeper, the screen a thin veil between judgment and empathy. Priests, often the most educated in their communities, fielded questions that blurred guidance and curiosity. Father, does a dream of my neighbor's wife count as sin? Or, what if the act was hurried, without full intent? You picture a young curate, face flushing beneath his cowl, probing for details that feel less like spiritual aid and more like vicarious indulgence. Enforcement of celibacy was uneven. In rural areas, far from bishops' oversight, many kept housekeepers who doubled as companions, their relationships an open secret tolerated by parishioners who preferred a relatable shepherd to a distant saint. One light joke slips in. If modern HR existed, the church might have offered confession burnout seminars, complete with tips on not getting too invested in the plot twists. Venturing into the rectory adjacent, a modest room with a pallid bed and shelves of leather-bound tomes, you sense the private torments that plagued these men. Nocturnal temptations haunted them, leading to self-imposed penances, like sleeping on bare floors or wearing hair shirts that chafed like constant reminders of frailty. A quirky fringe tidbit emerges from a 14th century Italian ledger. One friar maintained a tally of parishioners' carnal sins by category. Self-abuse on Mondays spiked after market days, while wives reported impure thoughts more than maidens, turning confessions into an odd statistical diary, perhaps for his edification or a misguided attempt at patterns in perdition. Was it scholarly zeal or fixation? The wax-sealed pages don't say, but they hint at how hearing sins could erode the hearer's resolve. Like waves wearing down a cliff, you overhear fragments from the booth. A widow detailing weekly visits from a shadowy suitor, her voice trembling, while the priest responds with questions that linger a beat too long. Scandals weren't rare. Father Pietro in a Tuscan village was reassigned after rumors of extended private absolutions with certain penitents, his candle burning late into the night. The church handled such lapses discreetly. No public trials for clergy, just quiet transfers to remote monasteries where temptations might be fewer or at least less documented. Yet, genuine remorse surfaced too. Some priests confessed to peers, admitting to widows or wayward nuns, their justifications poignant. She sought comfort, and I forgot my cloth. Another quip for levity. In an age without therapy apps, confession was the original talk it out session. Free, anonymous, and with eternal stakes if you lied. As the chapel empties, Vespers chants rising like a balm, you ponder the booth's dual role: sanctuary for the laity, snare for the ordained. Priests walked a razor's edge, their vows clashing with the flood of human frailty they absorbed daily. In urban centers like Paris, where temptations abounded, some turned to flagellation brotherhoods, whipping away urges in group rituals that bordered on masochistic release. But rural isolation bred different pitfalls. A lone vicar in the Scottish Highlands might find solace in a shepherdess's company, their encounters blamed on the devil's solitude. You rise, the pew creaking farewell, and glance at the confessional one, last time. Its lattice like a web catching souls. These spaces weren't just for forgiveness. They were mirrors reflecting society's obsessions at the men tasked with upholding them. Historians still argue whether confessions empowered the church through surveillance, gleaning secrets to wield influence, or offered genuine relief, a rare outlet in a repressed era where even thoughts were policed. Some see it as proto-psychology, others as a tool of control that kept guilt simmering. Either way, the whispers lingered, shaping lives long after absolution's words faded. Twilight deepens outside, and the path leads to a bustling town square where shadows lengthen and public spectacles await, turning private shames into communal theatre. Twilight deepens outside, and the path leads to a bustling town square where shadows lengthen and public spectacles await, turning private shames into communal theatre. You follow the cobblestone lane downhill, the chapel's silhouette shrinking behind you like a fading conscience, until the clamour swells. Voices raised in a mix of jeers and murmurs, the sharp clang of a bell summoning the crowd. The square opens before you, ringed by half-timbered houses with overhanging upper stories that lean in like nosy spectators, their windows crammed with faces peering down. Torches sputter to life, casting jittery flames that dance across the wooden platform at the center, where stocks and pillories stand like grim sentinels, their hinges oiled and ready. The air hums with anticipation, thick with the sense of unwashed bodies, rotting produce piled for hurling, and the acrid tang of fear sweat from the accused. This isn't justice in quiet chambers. It's a show, where forbidden desires are dragged into the light, flogged, and left as warnings for all to gawk at. You weave through the throng, elbows brushing coarse wool tunics, and the occasional velvet sleeve of a merchant, slumming it for the drama, finding a spot near the edge where you can observe without joining the fray. Today's spectacle features a man in his 40s, head bowed in the pillory, his neck and wrists locked in the wooden frame, face smeared with mud from earlier tosses. He's accused of adultery with the miller's wife, a charge whispered through alehouses until it reached the bailiff's ears. The crowd heckles, a boy lobbing a squishy apple that splats against his cheek, drawing laughter like thunder. But beneath the mockery, there's a current of unease. Everyone knows someone who skirted the edges, and today's victim could be tomorrow's neighbor. Mainstream historical fact anchors this in the 14th century French coutumes, legal customs that prescribed public humiliations for sexual offenses, like parading adulterers naked through streets or forcing them to wear signs proclaiming their sins, reinforcing community norms in an era before private prisons. As the magistrate reads the sentence, lashes and a day in the stocks, you sense the ritual's deeper purpose, not just punishment, but catharsis, a way for the village to exorcise its own guilts by piling them on one soul. The whip cracks, each stroke eliciting gasps from the onlookers, some crossing themselves, while others cheer, their faces flushed with a mix of righteousness and voyeuristic thrill. You imagine the accused's thoughts, regret swirling like the dust kicked up by shuffling feet, perhaps a stolen kiss in the mill's shadow, hands fumbling in haste, now amplified into public ruin. Women bore the harshest brunt. A nearby whisper recounts a baker's daughter, shaved bald and marched with a bell around her neck for lewd conduct, her crime whispering too sweetly to a traveling tinker. Gender double standards reigned supreme. Men often fined lightly while women faced exile, or worse, their bodies marked as vessels of temptation. Venturing closer as the flogging ends, you catch the man's labored breaths, his back striped red like a forbidden map. These spectacles weren't impromptu. They followed scripts, with criers announcing the event days prior, drawing crowds like a mummer's play. In one light joke that ripples through your mind, it's like medieval reality TV. Tune in for the drama, stay for the vegetable tossing, where the audience votes with turnips instead of likes. But humor fades when you consider the cruelty. Some punishments involved branding irons, searing letters like A for adulterer into flesh, echoes of which inspired later tales like Hawthorne's Scarlet Emblem, though here it was no metaphor. The square buzzes with side bets. Will he faint? Beg mercy. While vendors hawk pies and ale, turning shame into commerce. A quirky fringe tidbit surfaces from Burgundian records. In some towns, couples caught in infidelity were forced into reconciliation parades, chained together and made to kiss publicly, while villagers pelted them with flowers mixed with dung. A bizarre blend of romance and ridicule meant to mend their bond through humiliation. Picture the awkward peck, lips meeting amid jeers, garlic breath clashing with forced affection. Talk about a date night gone wrong. One chronicler noted a pair who divorced anyway, the wife quipping she'd rather kiss the donkey that carried her there. As the sun dips lower, painting the square in bruised purples, you witness the aftermath. The man slumped, crowd thinning as boredom sets in, a few pious souls dropping coins in a beggar's bowl nearby. These events weren't just for sex crimes. Cross-dressing or bold flirtations could land you here too. A tailor in Norwich, pilloried for donning his wife's kirtle while mending, paraded as a mannish fool amid laughter that masked deeper fears of blurred roles. The church orchestrated much of this, viewing public penance as soul-cleansing. but it often devolved into mob entertainment, with outcomes swayed by bribes or favoritism. You linger as stragglers disperse, a flute player striking up a jaunty tune to lighten the mood, notes floating like defiant sparks. These spectacles revealed society's underbelly, where lust was both universal sin and communal spectacle, punished to affirm order, yet exposing the fragility of that very structure. Historians still argue whether they deterred vice or merely provided a safety valve, allowing vicarious thrills that reinforce bonds through shared outrage. Some see them as unifying rituals in fractured communities, others as tools of patriarchal control, targeting women and outsiders to maintain hierarchies. Either way, they turned private pulses into public lessons, leaving scars that outlasted the stocks. Night falls fully now, torches guttering as the square empties, but distant whispers draw you toward flickering lights, where accusations turn darker, blending lust with the infernal entrails that burned hotter than any whip's sting. Night falls fully now, torches guttering as the square empties, but distant whispers draw you toward flickering lights, where accusations turn darker, blending lust with the infernal entrails that burned hotter than any whip's sting. You follow a narrow alley, twisting away from the village center, the cobblestones uneven underfoot, slick with evening dew that mirrors the uneasy sheen of fear in the air. The path leads to a makeshift tribunal set up in a barn on the outskirts, its doors ajar, spilling lamplight and the low hum of anxious voices onto the trampled grass. Hay bales serve as benches. A rough table holds inkpots and parchments, and at the center stands a woman bound to a post, her dress torn at the hem, eyes defiant amid the circle of torch-bearing accusers. This isn't a simple shaming, it's a witch hunt, where desire twists into demonic pacts, and the night air thickens with the scent of burning sage, meant to ward off evils that feel all too human. You edge closer, staying in the shadows cast by stacked crates, as the Inquisitor, a gaunt priest with a voice like grinding gravel, reads charges that chill despite the summer warmth, consorting with incubi, seducing men through unholy means, birthing imps disguised as babes. The woman, a healer named Eliza, shakes her head, her herbal pouches confiscated and scattered like accusations at her feet. Mainstream historical fact grounds this in the grim wave of 15th century European witch trials, fueled by texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, which detailed how demons preyed on women's insatiable carnality, using succubi to collect seed from men and incubi to impregnate victims, explaining everything from sleep terrors to unexplained pregnancies. Compiled in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer, this manual turned paranoia into procedure, leading to thousands persecuted, often widows or midwives whose knowledge of bodies threatened male authority. As testimony unfolds, villagers recount Eliza's bewitching gaze that made knees weak, or dreams where she appeared as a temptress with horns hidden under wild hair. One farmer swears she visited him nightly, her touch cold yet inflaming, leaving him drained and his crops blighted. A classic incubus tale, where lust became a scapegoat for misfortune. You imagine the dread in these accounts. Bodies betraying minds in sleep, waking to guilt that demanded an external culprit. The Church amplified this, preaching that Satan targeted the weak-willed, especially women, whose moist humors made them susceptible vessels. Trials like this weren't rare. In Lorraine, over 2,000 were executed in the late 1500s, many accused of sexual sorcery. Their confessions extracted through torture that broke bones and spirits alike. Venturing mentally into Eliza's perspective, you feel the injustice. Her crimes likely stemmed from herbal remedies for fertility or easing births, twisted by jealousy, a spurned suitor perhaps, or a rival healer spreading rumors. Interrogations delved invasively, midwives probing for devil's marks, like moles or scars, pricked with needles to test for painlessness. If blood didn't flow, guilt was sealed. A light joke flickers amid the horror. In an age without DNA tests, a freckle could damn you faster than a bad date, turning beauty spots into infernal kisses. But levity sours when you consider the strip searches under leering eyes, bodies commodified as evidence in a theater of fear. The barn fills with more tales, a succubus shape-shifting into a lost love, breath like brimstone yet kisses sweet as sin, leaving victims feverish and fields fallow. These narratives weren't just folklore. They mirrored societal anxieties, explaining taboo desires or assaults without blaming humans. Sleep paralysis, now a medical phenomenon, was then demonic ravishment, victims paralyzed as shadowy figures pressed upon them. One quirky fringe tidbit from Swiss chronicles. Some trials judged the temperature of demonic seed. Cold meant infernal. Warm meant lies, leading to absurd tests where women described sensations from dreams, their words twisted into nooses. Imagine the courtroom farce, a notary scribbling "feels like winter's chill" as proof, while lives hung in the balance. As the inquisitor calls for witnesses, a neighbor testifies to seeing Eliza dancing naked under the moon, herbs smoking in a cauldron, likely a solstice ritual for crops, but spun as a Sabbath orgy with cloven-hoofed lovers. Punishments loomed brutal: flogging, drowning, or burning, bodies displayed as deterrents. Yet, some resisted. Eliza spits defiance, claiming her visitors were angels granting healing knowledge, flipping the script on her accusers. This echoes real cases, like Joan of Arc's 1431 trial, where visions were deemed demonic seduction, her purity questioned to undermine her power. You shift uncomfortably as the crowd murmurs approval for her penance. A barefoot march with a candle, flames licking close to symbolize hell's grasp. These hunts weren't random. They targeted outsiders, healers whose potions eased unwanted pregnancies or stirred barren wombs, threatening church monopolies on miracles. In Germany, waves peaked during famines. Lust blamed for divine wrath, turning personal urges into communal curses. The tribunal adjourns with prayers, the woman led away under guard, her fate sealed by whispers and dread. These proceedings revealed lust's dark mirror, where desire became a weapon, wielded against the vulnerable. Historians still argue whether witch hunts were misogynistic purges, culling independent women amid Reformation chaos, or outbreaks of mass hysteria fueled by economic stress. Some estimate 50,000 executions across Europe. Others see them as localized power grabs by insecure clergy. Either way, they scorched societies, leaving ashes where curiosity once bloomed. Dawn creeps in, but the chill lingers, drawing you toward relics of control, devices forged in iron and myth, promising to lock away what trials couldn't burn. Dawn creeps in, but the chill lingers, drawing you toward relics of control, devices forged in iron and myth, promising to lock away what trials couldn't burn. You leave the barn's oppressive gloom behind, the inquisitor's voice fading like a bad dream, and follow a rutted cart track uphill toward a fortified smithy perched on a ridge, its forge glowing orange against the paling sky. Smoke billows from the chimney, carrying the metallic tang of hammered steel and the acrid bite of quenched metal, mingling with the fresh dawn scent of dew-kissed grass. This isn't a place of creation alone. It's where fears took physical form, where jealousy and piety birthed contraptions meant to cage the body's betrayals. You're delving into the enigmatic lore of chastity belts, those infamous symbols of medieval mistrust, where iron met intimacy in a clash that still sparks debate and disbelief. You step inside the smithy, heat blasting like a dragon's breath, the anvil ringing under the blacksmith's mallet as sparks fly like angry stars. On a workbench lies one such device, a hinged band of wrought iron, lined with softened leather, its front plate pierced with slits for necessity, locked by a mechanism that clicks shut with finality. The key, dangling from a chain, gleams mockingly. These weren't everyday wear, if they were worn at all. Mainstream historical scrutiny reveals most surviving examples date to the Renaissance or later, often ornate curiosities crafted more for display than daily use. Museums like the Cluny in Paris House alleged medieval specimens, but experts date them to the 16th century, suggesting they were satirical inventions or anti-temptation tools for specific contexts, like crusaders leaving wives behind. Though chronicles from the Third Crusade mention no such gadgets, focusing instead on oaths and prayers. As you examine the belt's intricate engravings, vines twisting like forbidden embraces, you ponder its mythic origins. Tales spun by 19th century antiquarians painted them as commonplace. Knights securing their ladies before quests, keys worn as necklaces like twisted talismans. But dig deeper, and the narrative unravels. No contemporary accounts from the High Middle Ages describe routine use, and practicalities defy logic. How to bathe, relieve oneself, or avoid infections in an era without antibiotics. One light joke surfaces amid the skepticism. If these were real, medieval laundry days must have been a nightmare, with more rust than romance in the rinse. Instead, scholars trace the concept to allegorical literature, like Conrad Kieser's 1405 Belli Fortis, a military treatise illustrating a belt as a humorous siege engine against infidelity, not a literal prescription. Venturing into symbolic territory, you realize these devices embody deeper cultural neuroses. In a society where virginity equated value, brides as bargaining chips in alliances, the belt represented patriarchal lockdown, a mechanical extension of vows that viewed women's bodies as property to safeguard. Yet, evidence suggests they were rare, perhaps punishment tools for wayward spouses or sex workers in city edicts from Venice, where 15th century laws mandated iron drawers for prostitutes during Lent, blending piety with control. A quirky fringe tidbit adds intrigue. Some alleged male versions, like spiked codpieces from German armories, were purportedly self-imposed by penitent husbands or monks seeking to thwart urges. One example featuring a lock that required an abbot's key. Talk about trusting your superior with the family jewels. Archaeological finds are scant, with most medieval belts exposed as Victorian forgeries, crafted to titillate collectors in an age obsessed with exotic pasts. You circle the workbench, fingers tracing the cold metal, imagining the discomfort, chafing straps, the constant clink with every step, a reminder of suspicion louder than any vow. Literature amplified the myth. Fabliaux tales from 13th century France mocked jealous husbands commissioning belts, only for clever wives to bribe locksmiths or hide duplicates, turning control into comedy. In one rollicking story, a knight returns from pilgrimage to find his belted bride pregnant, the key still on his belt. Cue the punchline about miraculous expansion. These narratives poked at male insecurities, suggesting that where there's a lock, there's always a pick, human ingenuity triumphing over hardware. As the blacksmith pauses, wiping sweat with a sooty rag, he shares a local legend. A baroness who wore one voluntarily to prove fidelity, but secretly commissioned a duplicate for trysts, her virtue becoming village folklore. Such stories highlight how belts symbolized more than restraint, jealousy, power dynamics, even kink in disguise. Church fathers like Thomas Aquinas condemned lust, but tacitly endorsed controls that preserved marital order, viewing the body as a battlefield where sin lurked in every curve. Yet, practical use seems overstated. Medical texts warned of health risks like ulcers or infertility from prolonged wear, suggesting rarity beyond symbolism. You step back into the cooling dawn, the forge's heat lingering on your skin like a cautionary warmth. These devices, real or legendary, encapsulated an era's paradoxes, preaching purity while fearing the flesh, crafting chains for what hearts couldn't contain. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were widespread tools of oppression or largely fictional props in moral tales. Some cite scant artifacts as proof of elite use. Others dismiss them as Renaissance inventions retrofitted to medieval law, amplified by later eras' fascination with Dark Ages barbarity. Either way, they endure as emblems of control's futility, iron unable to bind what desire dissolves. The sun rises higher, casting long shadows that point toward grander rituals, where weddings blend duty and display, sheets inspected like treaties in the making. The sun rises higher, casting long shadows that point toward grander rituals, where weddings blend duty and display, sheets inspected like treaties in the making. You crest the ridge, leaving the smithy's clang behind like a discarded chain, and descend into a valley where a grand manor house sprawls amid manicured orchards, its turrets piercing a sky now streaked with morning gold. Laughter and lute music spill from open windows, carried on breezes scented with blooming orchards, apples and pears ripening like promises unkept. This is no ordinary day. Servants bustle with garlands of wildflowers and trays of honeyed pastries, preparing for a union that seals alliances as much as hearts. You're stepping into the elaborate theatre of medieval weddings, where vows are public pageants. But the true test unfolds behind closed doors, Under watchful eyes that turn intimacy into inspection, you mingle with the arriving guests, knights in embroidered doublets, ladies in flowing kirtles of silk that shimmer like river water, finding a spot near the chapel entrance where the bride emerges in a gown of ivory samite, veil cascading like a waterfall, her face pale beneath a circlet of pearls. The groom, a sturdy lord with a trimmed beard and eyes scanning for approval, stands rigid in velvet hose. Their match, arranged since childhood, binds estates and ends a feud. Love, if it blooms, is a happy accident. The ceremony unfolds in Latin murmurs, rings exchanged under the priest's blessing, holy water sprinkled like insurance against future strays. But medieval marriages weren't sealed at the altar. Consummation was the key, and for elites, it often became a spectacle, ensuring legitimacy in a world where bloodlines dictated power. As the feast commences in the great hall, tables groaning under roasted swans, spiced wines flowing like rivers of forgetfulness, you sense the undercurrent of anticipation. Guests toast boisterously, minstrels strum ballads of chivalric romance, but whispers circulate about the bedding to come. Mainstream historical fact illuminates this from 12th century Norman customs, where noble unions required witnesses to the couple's first night, a holdover from ensuring no pre-wedding deceptions tainted inheritances. The Church mandated consummation for validity, but secular traditions amplified it into ritual, with family and courtiers escorting the pair to chambers amid crude jests and thrown petals, as if fertility needed an audience to flourish. You trail the procession up spiral stairs, lit by sputtering torches that cast elongated shadows like elongated doubts, the bride's hand trembling in her groom's grip. The chamber awaits, a four-poster bed draped in embroidered linens, canopy heavy with symbolism, roses for passion, lilies for purity. Attendants undress the couple with practiced efficiency, laughter masking awkwardness, until they're beneath the sheets, curtains drawn but not fully, allowing peeks that confirm the deed. No privacy here. Aunts murmur encouragements, uncles crack jokes about ploughing the field, while a priest blesses the mattress against evil spirits. You imagine the pressure, the groom fumbling under expectant gazes, the bride feigning composure, their union less spark than a scripted performance. A light joke flits through. If stage fright hits, the whole dynasty might teeter. Talk about performance anxiety with an actual crowd. The ritual peaks with the sheet inspection. Linens paraded the next morning to display bloodstains as proof of virginity, hung from balconies like triumphant flags. In Italian city-states, this morning gift display could make or break reputations. No spots meant accusations of fraud, dowries revoked, alliances shattered. Clever brides improvised, pricked fingers, animal blood smuggled in vials, or servants sworn to secrecy. One quirky fringe tidbit from Bavarian folklore. In some regions, if stains were absent, the groom might claim divine intervention. But more often, midwives testified to tight virtues with herbal aids, turning potential scandal into celebrated purity. Picture the absurdity. A chicken's contribution saving a marriage, feathers ruffled in more ways than one. Not all weddings demanded such intrusion. Lower nobility sometimes skipped the parade, but for highborns like those in the French court, it was non-negotiable, echoing Roman traditions adapted to Christian mores. Post-ceremony, The couple endured toasts that grew bawdier, guests banging goblets for kisses that foreshadowed the night. In one infamous 14th century Aragonese union, the bedding turned chaotic when a rival snuck in a potion-laced wine, leading to a groom too eager for decorum. His mishaps retold in ballads for generations. Another quip. Weddings were the original group project, where everyone had input but only two did the work, and got graded on it publicly. As dawn filters through leaded windows, the sheets are whisked away for scrutiny. The bride's mother nodding approval at fabricated evidence, whispers of relief rippling through kin. These customs weren't mere voyeurism. They safeguarded legacies, preventing impostors or non-virgins from diluting bloodlines. Yet, they exposed hypocrisies. The groom's past dalliances ignored, his experience expected to ensure success. Medical treatises advised grooms on governed haste, lest haste spoil the proof, while brides learned poise from mothers' tales. You slip from the manor as celebrations wind down, the couple left to uneasy solitude, their night more duty than delight. These rituals blended joy and judgment, turning beds into battlegrounds where desire met obligation under scrutiny's glare. Historians still argue whether bedding ceremonies empowered families through transparency or invaded personal sanctity, fostering resentment in unions. Some see them as communal bonds, strengthening alliances. Others as patriarchal tools reinforcing women's commodification, with evidence from annulment records showing how failed nights led to dissolved matches. Either way, they etched intimacy into public memory, sheets as contracts inked in blood. Midday sun beats down, guiding you to shadowed pews where preachers rail against the very fires these rituals stoked, their words thundering like judgments from on high. 11. Midday sun beats down, guiding you to shadowed pews where preachers rail against the very fires these rituals stoked, their words thundering like judgments from on high. You crest a gentle hill, the manor's festivities a distant hum now, replaced by the solemn toll of a church bell echoing across fields dotted with grazing sheep, their woolly forms oblivious to the human dramas unfolding nearby. The village church rises modest, yet imposing, its stone facade weathered by rains and regrets, arched windows framing glimpses of flickering candles within. Ivy climbs the walls like veins pulsing with ancient secrets, and the air carries the faint, comforting waft of baked bread from a nearby oven, a reminder that life persists amid lectures on its perils. This is the pulpit's domain, where clergy wielded words as weapons against the flesh, condemning desires that simmered in every heart, even as the very art adorning their sanctuaries teased with temptations carved in stone and color. You enter through the creaking side door, the interior cool and dim, sunlight slanting through colored glass to paint the floor in fragmented rainbows that dance like elusive joys. The nave stretches before you, pews worn smooth by generations of fidgeting parishioners, the altar draped in embroidered cloth that gleams with threads of gold. A priest ascends the pulpit, robes billowing like storm clouds, his voice booming forth in a sermon that fills the space, echoing off vaulted ceilings etched with faded frescoes of Adam and Eve's gong fall. "Beware the serpent's whisper," he intones, fist pounding the lectern, eyes sweeping the congregation like a scythe. Medieval preaching wasn't subtle. It hammered home lust's dangers, viewing it as the root of all vice, a legacy from the garden where one bite unleashed endless craving. Mainstream historical fact draws from 13th century Dominican sermons, like those of Thomas Aquinas, who classified sins of the flesh in meticulous detail, adultery worse than fornication, but both gateways to hellfire, urging abstinence outside procreation, even within marriage, lest pleasure eclipse duty. As the homily unfolds, the priest paints vivid pictures, bodies as battlefields where demons lurk in loins, waiting to strike during idle moments or fevered nights. He warns of positions beyond the natural, frequencies too indulgent, moods too joyful, enjoyment itself a red flag, turning marital beds into potential pitfalls. You imagine the flock shifting uncomfortably, wives glancing at husbands, youths blushing behind hands, as he quotes Augustine, "Lust is the enemy within, a fire that consumes the soul." These orations weren't weekly whims. They stemmed from councils like Lateran IV, mandating moral education to combat rising urban vices, with friars traveling circuits to deliver fire and brimstone specials that drew crowds like spectacles. A light joke crosses your mind. If podcasts existed, these would top charts under motivational terror, with episode titles like "Why Your Thoughts Are Sending You to Hell" and "How to Stop." Venturing into the side aisles, you study the walls adorned with carvings and paintings that complicate the message. Demons groping at monks in tormented poses, saints resisting nubile temptresses with expressions mingling horror and hint of longing. One fresco shows Eve offering the apple, her form curvaceous enough to make the forbidden fruit seem secondary, a subtle irony where art meant to warn instead whispered invitations. The Church navigated this duality carefully. Visual aids reinforced sermons, but often stirred what they sought to suppress, like a 14th century Italian altarpiece depicting the Magdalene in sensual repentance, her tears glistening on bared skin that drew more eyes than the crucifix above. Preachers railed against ocular adultery, mere looking as sin, yet surrounded worshippers with images that tested resolve. Adam's fig leaf barely concealing, serpents coiling suggestively. The sermon turns to practical prohibitions. No congress on Sundays, feast days, or during Lent. Abstain during menses, pregnancy, or nursing. Tallies from penitentials suggest couples had perhaps 100 permissible days yearly, guilt shadowing the rest. Even in wedlock, the priest thunders, delight without purpose is the devil's delight. He cites nocturnal emissions as pollutions, demanding penance. Monks are advised to sleep arms crossed like corpses to ward off dreams. A quirky fringe tidbit from English monastic rules. Some orders banned beans, believing they inflamed passions via winds that stirred lower regions. Flatulence as foreplay's foe, leading to bland diets where lentils replaced lust, though skeptics noted the gas probably deterred closeness anyway. Imagine the refectory debates. Pass the peas, but sparingly, brother, lest we tempt fate. As the congregation kneels for the final prayer, heads bowed in a sea of hoods and veils, you ponder the mixed signals. Sermons decrying flesh, while reliquaries housed saints' bones credited with fertility miracles. Pilgrims kissing them for blessings that bordered on erotic hope. Hymnals included bridal songs to Christ, language lush with union and penetration of the soul, blurring divine and carnal love. One preacher in Avignon famously equated tongue kissing to summoning succubi, his flock tittering nervously. Another quip: if French kissing invited demons, no wonder the language of love originated there. The service ends, faithful filing out with bowed heads, but the priest's words linger like smoke, shaping behaviors from cradle to grave. These diatribes weren't idle. They influenced laws, like sumptuary codes, curbing revealing attire to prevent incitements. Yet, art contradicted. Illuminated manuscripts from monastic scriptoria showed naked souls in paradise, bodies idealized in ways that fueled fantasies. You trace a carving of David and Bathsheba, her bath scene detailed enough for a blush. Warning or wish list, exiting into sunlight that now feels probing. You reflect on preaching's role in a sex-saturated yet suppressed society. Historians still argue whether these warnings fostered repression or rebellion, with some claiming they internalized guilt, stifling joy, while others see them as ineffective theater, people nodding in church then sinning in shadows. Evidence from confessionals shows recidivism rates suggesting words thundered but rarely stuck, human nature proving resilient against rhetorical storms. Afternoon shadows lengthen, leading to quieter corners where same-sex affections hid in plain sight, coded in glances and verses that the pulpit's fire couldn't fully scorch. Afternoon shadows lengthen, leading to quieter corners where same-sex affections hid in plain sight, coded in glances and verses that the pulpit's fire couldn't fully scorch. You veered off the main thoroughfare, away from the church's echoing admonitions, into a labyrinth of back streets where the cobblestones narrow and the buildings lean closer as if sharing confidences. The air here feels thicker, laced with the subtle musk of wood smoke from hidden hearths and the faint, lingering perfume of lavender sachets tucked into pockets, scents that mask more than they reveal. Laughter spills from a half-open shutter, two voices intertwining in easy harmony, drawing you toward a small tavern tucked in the lee of a merchant's warehouse. This isn't the boisterous inn of rowdy travelers. It's a refuge for those who navigate love's edges, where bonds between same souls flicker like candles in a draught, persistent despite the winds of doctrine that seek to snuff them out. You ease onto a bench in the tavern's dim interior, the room warmed by a low fire that crackles softly, casting golden flickers on faces turned toward each other in quiet conversation. A pair of artisans share a tankard, their knees brushing under the table, hands gesturing animatedly over a shared sketch. Nothing overt, but the air between them hums with unspoken understanding. Medieval society declared such affections impossible, labeling them sodomy or unnatural vice, sins ranking just below heresy in the Church's hierarchy of horrors. Yet they endured in the margins, veiled in brotherhoods or sisterly devotions that society could stomach. Mainstream historical fact emerges from 14th century Italian court records, like those in Florence, where men were fined for embracing in the manner of lovers during festivals, their punishments light if they claimed it was mere camaraderie, evidence of a thriving undercurrent in urban centers where anonymity allowed expressions that rural vigilance crushed. Deeper into this shadowed world, you imagine the coded languages that shielded these bonds. poems exchanged in monastic cells, where a monk's ode to his beloved companion praised eyes like dawn and hands steady as faith, words that could pass as spiritual kinship, but pulsed with deeper yearning. In convents, spiritual friendships flourished, women penning letters that spoke of souls entwined like vines, their prose lush with biblical allusions to Ruth and Naomi or David and Jonathan, pairs the church exalted as platonic ideals, unwittingly providing cover for more. You picture two nuns in a garden cloister, fingers brushing over shared prayer books, their whispers blending devotion and desire in the rustle of habits against stone benches. A light joke whispers through, if emojis existed, their missives might end with a winking saint instead of a heart, fooling censors while signaling intent to the initiated. Venturing mentally into noble circles, you uncover surprising tolerances. Kings like Edward II of England faced scandals over favourites like Piers Gaveston, their brotherhood sparking rumours of beds shared and gifts lavish enough to rival queens. Chroniclers tiptoed around details, but poems and plays hinted at passions that defied the throne's expectations, leading to political upheavals masked as moral outrages. In women's spheres, ladies-in-waiting formed intense attachments, their chambers echoing with laughter that hushed at footsteps, letters burned after reading to evade prying eyes. One quirky fringe tidbit from 13th century French manuscripts. Some pairs exchanged mock betrothal rings, carved from wood or bone, worn on hidden chains as talismans of commitment. Rituals borrowed from chivalric tales, but adapted to their realities. Imagine the thrill of a secret ceremony under moonlight, vows whispered where no priest would bless. As you sip an imagined mug of spiced ale, foam clinging like unspoken words, you overhear fragments. A tailor praising his apprentice's deft touch, words layered with meaning. A midwife confiding in her companion about shared burdens that go beyond herbs and births. These weren't always physical. Emotional intimacies sustained many, like the brethren in religious orders who vowed fraternal love that blurred into dependency, their cells shared for warmth and more. Literature preserved traces, anonymous lyrics from troubadour traditions occasionally flipped genders, singing of fair knights or gentle maids in ways that subverted norms, circulating in underground codices that evaded burnings. The tavern quiets as dusk deepens, patrons leaning closer, their stories unfolding in hushed tones that carry the weight of risk. Discovery meant penance, exile, or worse, like the two English clerks in 1395 tried for abominable acts, their sentence commuted to fines due to influential friends. Yet resilience shone. Some formed covert networks, meeting in bathhouses or during pilgrimages where crowds offered cover. You envision a pair of merchants on the road to Canterbury, their pilgrim fellowship deepening into nights by campfires, tales shared turning tender under stars that judged no one. These hidden bonds challenged the era's rigid binaries, where the church's silence on specifics left loopholes. Sodomy undefined beyond against nature, allowing deniability if no acts were witnessed. A light joke here. In a world without labels, love was DIY, crafted from scraps of scripture and stolen moments, like bootleg wine fermented in secret cellars. But dangers loomed. Inquisitions probed particular friendships, dissolving ties deemed too close, as in a 15th century Spanish convent where sisters were separated after letters surfaced, their excessive affection branded suspicious. You rise as the fire dims, embers glowing like guarded passions, reflecting on how these affections persisted despite erasure. Historians still argue whether they represent queer continuities, with some viewing them as romantic identities in embryo expressed through available cultural scripts, while others caution against anachronism, seeing them as intense homosocial ties amplified by gender segregation, not necessarily erotic, but emotionally profound in affection-starved lives. Either way, they added hues to history's palette, loves that bloomed in cracks where light seldom reached. Night envelops the streets fully, but distant lanterns flicker from establishments where desires aren't hidden, but harnessed, regulated like any trade in the flickering glow of sanctioned sin. Night envelops the streets fully, but distant lanterns flicker from establishments where desires aren't hidden, but harnessed, regulated like any trade in the flickering glow of sanctioned sin. You follow the soft clink of coins and the murmur of laughter down a cobbled alley, where the air shifts from the tavern's homely warmth to a headier blend of rosewater, musk, and the sharp tang of spilled wine. The alley opens into a bustling quarter, its narrow houses aglow with candlelight that spills through latticed shutters, framing silhouettes that dance in suggestive rhythm. This is the red light district of a medieval city. Think 14th century Toulouse or London's Southwark, where brothels operated not in shadows, but under civic oversight. Their doors marked by painted signs, a red heart, a coiled serpent, or a peacock feather swaying in the breeze like a beckoning finger. You're stepping into a world where lust wasn't just tolerated, but taxed. A pragmatic compromise between piety and profit in a society that couldn't outrun its urges. You pause at the threshold of a licensed house, its facade adorned with crimson drapes that flutter like whispered promises, the interior warm with the scent of beeswax candles and fresh straw strewn on the floor to soak up spills. Women in bright kirtles, some with belts dyed scarlet to signal their trade, move with practiced ease, pouring ale for merchants or teasing knights with banter sharper than their swords. This wasn't chaos, but order. Mainstream historical fact reveals that by the 13th century, cities like Vienna and Florence regulated brothels as municipal utilities, issuing licenses, mandating health checks, and collecting taxes to pave roads or repair bridges. Yes, medieval infrastructure sometimes ran on desire's coin. In Augsburg, a 1372 ordinance required sex workers to wear green cloaks with yellow stripes, ensuring visibility while funneling revenue to civic coffers, a system so efficient it funded city walls. Venturing inside, you're greeted by a madam named Cecile, her auburn hair braided with ribbons, eyes sharp as she tallies earnings on a wax tablet. She runs this house like a guild hall, negotiating with tax collectors and ensuring her workers' safety, a far cry from the lawless dens of later myths. The women here aren't just bodies, they're storytellers, weaving tales for clients who seek companionship as much as release. Soldiers fresh from campaigns, widowers craving warmth, even clergy who slip in after vespers, hoods pulled low. Cecile winks, joking that her best customers pray hardest on Sundays. A light quip that hides a truth. The Church, per St. Augustine's pragmatic view, saw brothels as sewers for society's sins, channeling urges to protect virtuous women, a hypocrisy that let men sin while women bore the stigma. The setup fascinates you. Rooms partitioned by heavy curtains, each with a pallid bed and a basin for washing. The air thick with laughter and the clink of cups. Some women play cards with clients. Others sing bawdy tunes, creating an illusion of intimacy that's both business and balm. But beneath the joviality lies a grim reality. Many entered this life through poverty or coercion, girls sold by families or fleeing abusive lords. A 14th century Venetian record notes girls as young as 13 working under guardians who took most profits, their agency limited to choosing smiles over tears. Yet, some thrived. A quirky fringe tidbit from London's Bankside reveals women branding services with symbols, a boot for dominance, a lily for tenderness, advertised on doorposts like medieval menus, letting clients pick their pleasure with a glance. Imagine the signage. Lily special tonight, 2 shillings, no clergy discount. You overhear a conversation by the hearth where a worker named Marjorie shares her story. Once a weaver's daughter, she chose this over starvation, now saving for a dowry to rejoin respectable life. Her pragmatism echoes broader patterns. Some rose to manage houses, others retired as shopkeepers, their pasts buried under new names. But risks loomed. Plague outbreaks scapegoated sex workers, leading to expulsions or public whippings, like in 1349 Paris, when loose women were blamed for God's wrath. Even clients faced penalties if caught, though nobles often escaped with fines, while workers endured lashings. As you explore further, the district's proximity to sacred spaces jars you. St. Mary's Church looms across the street, its bells tolling compline, while moans drift from open windows, a juxtaposition that feels deliberate. Bishops occasionally blessed these houses for moral containment, a pragmatic nod to human nature, though sermons later decried the same acts they profited from. Another light joke. If medieval Yelp existed, brothels might boast 5 stars next to cathedral, convenient for absolution. But the humor fades when you consider the power imbalance. Clients from elite circles, consequences borne by the women, their bodies both commodity and currency in a system that thrived on their labor. You linger by a window, watching a couple negotiate terms with gestures as old as trade itself, their transaction blending survival and fleeting joy. These districts didn't just manage desire, they mirrored society's contradictions, offering release while reinforcing control, profiting from what pulpits condemned. Historians still argue whether they empowered women with economic agency. Some owned property, like a 15th century madam in Bruges who left a will, or entrenched exploitation, trapping the vulnerable in cycles of dependency with no escape. Either way, they were microcosms of medieval life, where desire found a price and a place, flickering brightly before the dawn's judgment. The lanterns dim as you step back into the night, drawn toward voices of women who refuse such pricing, carving paths of defiance in a world that sought to bind them. The lanterns dim as you step back into the night, drawn toward voices of women who refuse such pricing, carving paths of defiance in a world that sought to bind them. You wander deeper into the quarter's winding lanes, away from the brothel's glowing windows and the muffled sounds of negotiated affections, toward quieter dwellings where lamplight spills softly onto thresholds like invitations to untold stories. The air cools here, carrying the earthy aroma of cooling hearth fires and the faint herbal tang of drying lavender bundles hung from eaves, scents that speak of self-sufficiency rather than seduction for sale. This is the domain of women who charted their courses, widows reclaiming their fates, mistresses wielding influence from shadowed chambers, and rebels who bent society's rules until they snapped, turning desire from a chain into a key that unlocked doors long barred. You pause at a modest cottage on the quarter's edge, its thatched roof sagging slightly under the weight of years, like shoulders bearing unspoken burdens. Inside, through a cracked shutter, you glimpse 3 women around a scarred oak table. An older widow with silver-streaked hair, her hands deftly weaving a basket. A younger one, perhaps a former lady-in-waiting, stirring a pot over the fire. And another, sharp-eyed and quick-smiling, mending a cloak. They share this space not as servants or kin, but as chosen companions, their laughter low and intimate, hands brushing in passing with a familiarity that defies the era's expectations. These are the defiant ones, women who navigated love and lust on their terms, often at great risk, in a world that viewed unattached females as anomalies or threats. Mainstream historical fact highlights figures like Christine de Pizan, the 14th century Italian-born writer in France, who, widowed young, supported her family through her pen, authoring works like The Book of the City of Ladies that championed women's intellect and autonomy, subtly critiquing marital constraints while advocating for self-reliance, amid desires dismissed as frivolous. Venturing closer in your mind's eye, you imagine slipping inside, the door creaking like a hesitant confession, to hear their stories unfold over shared bread and ale. The widow, let's call her Agnes, speaks first. Left property by a merchant husband, she declined remarriage, instead taking a lover, a traveling scribe, who visits under the cover of night. Their encounters a quiet rebellion against the church's push for chaste widowhood. In many regions, widows held rare power, managing estates or guilds, their status allowing flirtations or affairs that wives dared not pursue. But this freedom came laced with peril. Gossip could strip inheritance, as in a 13th century English case where a widow's unseemly companionship led to her lands being seized by greedy kin. Agnes chuckles softly, joking that her bed is warmer than any sermon on virtue, a light quip that masks the steel in her voice, her choices a shield against loneliness in a society that equated single women with suspicion. Beside her sits Isabella, a mistress to a local baron, her position no secret, but a strategic perch from which she influences whispers in his ear, securing favors for friends or family. Mistresses like her weren't mere dalliances. They often held court in their own right, like Agnès Sorel, mistress to Charles VII of France in the 15th century, who shaped policy and fashion, her low-necked gowns sparking trends and scandals alike. Isabella leans in, her eyes twinkling as she describes slipping notes into her lover's saddlebag, their trysts in haylofts or hidden grottos where moonlight filters through leaves like fragmented blessings. Yet, precariousness shadows this power. A discarded mistress could face ruin, as when one in Burgundy was cast out pregnant, her child absorbed into a convent while she begged on roadsides. A quirky fringe tidbit adds flavor. In 14th century Flanders, some mistresses formed informal sisterhoods, sharing tips on potions for conception or avoidance, their networks an underground guild where knowledge was currency. One recipe involving nettle tea to bind a man's wandering eye, passed like a treasured heirloom. The third woman, Elara, embodies outright rebellion, a healer who lives on the forest's fringe, her hut a sanctuary of dried herbs hanging from rafters, their pungent scents warding off both ills and intruders. She's taken lovers of both sexes, brief and bold, refusing the nunnery or marriage her family urged. Her hands, calloused from gathering roots, gesture animatedly as she recounts evading a suitor's proposal by claiming a spirit husband in the woods, a tale that sparked whispers of witchcraft but bought her freedom. Rebels like her dotted the landscape, from Brewsters running alehouses where they drank and dallied freely, to wanderers posing as pilgrims to escape scrutiny. In one light joke, Elara might quip that her bed's like her brews, potent, varied, and best enjoyed without a priest's blessing, until you recall the dangers. A similar woman in Provence was flogged for masculine arrogance after wearing breeches to ride astride, her defiance seen as unnatural. These women, in their shared hearth, represent a spectrum of autonomy, their desires tools for navigation rather than downfall. They gossip about a local guild where widows vote on decisions, their voices carrying weight in male-dominated trades. But shadows loom. The church eyed such independence warily, labeling it unseemly, while men feared women unbound by hearth or husband. You feel the warmth of their fire, the solidarity in their glances, a quiet revolution brewed over stew pots and mending needles. As midnight nears, the conversation turns to legacies, wills drafted to favor dear friends, charms sewn into hems for protection. Historians still argue whether these defiant roles signaled proto-feminism, empowering women to claim agency through sexuality in restrictive times, or if they were marginal exceptions, their stories amplified by survival bias, while most suffered silently under patriarchal yokes. Some cite rising female guild memberships as evidence of broader shifts. Others point to persistent legal barriers, like inheritance laws favoring sons, suggesting autonomy was illusory for all but the boldest. Either way, these women wove defiance into life's fabric, their threads stronger for the tension. The fire crackles low, embers glowing as you slip away, drawn toward streets where fabrics whisper their seductions, clothing that conceals and reveals in equal measure. You leave the cottage's warm glow behind, the women's voices fading into the night's embrace like echoes of resilience that linger in your thoughts, pulling you toward the bustling heart of the market square where daylight returns with a vengeance. The sun hangs high now, baking the earth and drawing crowds to stalls piled high with bolts of fabric that shimmer in the breeze. Linens crisp as fresh snow, velvets deep as midnight wine, silks flowing like liquid moonlight captured in thread. The air buzzes with haggling voices, the sharp clip of shears, and the earthy scent of dyes, indigo's bitter tang mingling with madder's fiery red, a sensory symphony that turns shopping into subtle warfare. This isn't mere commerce. It's the arena of fashion as seduction, where clothing whispers secrets of status, sparks flirtations with a glimpse of skin, and fuels quiet rebellions against the rigid codes that sought to cloak desire in modesty's drab veil. You weave through the throng, brushing past merchants, unfurling rolls of cloth that catch the light like invitations, their voices rising in praise. Feel this damask, my lord, smooth as a lover's sigh. Garments here weren't just coverings. They were canvases for the soul's unspoken yearnings, layered with meaning in an era where the church decreed simplicity, but humanity craved splendor. Mainstream historical fact anchors this in the sumptuary laws of 14th century England and Italy, edicts that dictated who could wear what, peasants barred from silk, merchants limited in fur trims, to preserve class hierarchies and curb moral decay from ostentatious displays that might incite envy, or worse, lust. A noblewoman's gown with a neckline dipping just so could signal availability or power, while a man's tight hose accentuated forms that drew eyes and whispers, turning daily dress into a dance of allure. Venturing closer to a tailor's stall, you watch a seamstress pin a bodice on a young woman, the lacing pulled taut to cinch the waist, sleeves slashed to reveal puffs of contrasting linen, like teasing glimpses through a keyhole. Fabric spoke volumes. Velvet's plush nap invited touch. Fur linings promised warmth that extended to imagined embraces. Colors carried codes. Red for passion, green for hope, black for mourning that sometimes hid illicit joys. Hair, too, was erotic terrain. Theologians like St. Paul insisted on coverings to prevent temptation, yet noble ladies let tendrils escape veils in calculated curls, a rebellion veiled as accident. You imagine a knight's gaze lingering on such a lock during a feast, his pulse quickening as if the strand were a siren's call. A light joke bubbles up. In a time without selfies, a well-placed ribbon was the original filter, enhancing what nature provided while dodging the bishop's frown. Deeper into the market's chaos, you spot accessories that amplified the game. Gloves scented with musk, passed as tokens in courtly exchanges, but carrying the giver's essence like a portable promise. Shoes with elongated poulaines, those pointed toes curling upward in phallic defiance, so extreme that church decrees limited their length to curb prideful strides. In 1363, English laws capped toe extensions based on rank, but whispers suggested longer points hinted at other endowments, turning footwear into flirtatious boasts. Women countered with fitted surcoats that hugged curves, or partlets, neck coverings, that could slip just enough to reveal a collarbone's curve, a subtle act of agency in a world that commodified their forms. Sensory details paint the allure, the rustle of taffeta against skin, the gleam of embroidered thread catching sunlight, each element a code in the language of longing. But fashion's edge cut both ways, fueling rebellion amid seduction. Commoners flouted laws by dyeing homespun in forbidden hues, a quiet uprising against class chains. A weaver in Bruges fined for purple trim that mimicked nobility, her defiance a stitch in the tapestry of resistance. Cross-dressing added danger. Men in flowing robes mocked as effeminate. Women in breeches branded unnatural. Yet some used disguise for freedom, like a French maiden donning hose to join a pilgrimage unchaperoned. Her adventure whispered in taverns as legend. A quirky fringe tidbit from Venetian records. Codpieces, those padded pouches at hose fronts, evolved from functional to flamboyant by the 15th century, some embroidered with jewels or shaped like beasts, symbolizing virility while hiding ailments like syphilis. Practical peacockery, where fashion met folly in a bulge that bellowed status. You haggle mentally over a bolt of crimson wool, its dye derived from crushed insects imported from distant shores, a luxury that screamed wealth and wantonness to Puritans. Preachers decried such finery as Satan's snares, silk clinging like second skin. But wearers persisted, turning prohibition into provocation. In courts, a dropped handkerchief sparked scandals, its lace edges a map to hidden intents. In villages, a bright sash at a fair signaled availability, colors broadcasting what words couldn't, gender norms rigidified through cloth, men in sturdy broadcloth, women in flowing layers. But outliers challenged. A Scottish Highlander in a kilt-like plaid, blurring lines that lowland laws frowned upon. As the market winds down, stalls folding like secrets tucked away, you reflect on how attire armored the self while exposing the soul. These threads wove status with seduction, a hem's lift or a sleeve's cling igniting sparks that laws couldn't douse. Historians still argue whether fashion liberated through expression, allowing subtle rebellions against sumptuary strictures, or constrained by enforcing hierarchies, with enforcement spotty but symbolic. Some see it as empowering women via adornment's agency, others as reinforcing objectification, sumptuary finds hitting the aspirational hardest. Either way, clothing whispered revolutions, each stitch a potential unraveling of the era's tight weave. The market quiets, but night stirs anew, pulling you toward shadowed realms where dreams don demonic masks, and lust lurks in the liminal space between sleep and sin. The fire is low now, embers glowing softly like fading memories of candlelit confessions and whispered vows, inviting you to settle deeper into the quiet embrace of the night. Let the echoes of medieval desires drift gently away, their passionate storms softening into a tranquil haze that wraps around you like a well-worn cloak, warm and reassuring. You've wandered through halls of longing and fields of forbidden touch, glimpsed saints in ecstasy and sinners in shadow. But now it's time to release those vivid scenes, allowing them to dissolve into the peaceful rhythm of your breath, slow and steady as a distant lullaby. The past, with all its fervent yearnings and quiet rebellions, rests beside you, not as a weight, but as a gentle companion, reminding you that even in history's deepest silences, the heart finds its calm. Dim the thoughts, ease the mind, and let sleep claim you softly, dreams unfolding like petals in the dark, unhurried and kind. Sweet dreams await, where no judgments linger, only the serene flow of time's endless river.